Hi, everybody, and welcome to another of our conversations between Maupin Brar and Caleb Maupin. And today we're going to be talking about the international significance of the October Revolution. You know, we recently passed the 30-year anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a tragedy for the working class and for the world. But of course, it's an opportunity for bourgeois politicians, historians, commentators of all kinds to bring out and rehash all their favorite lies about socialism and about the Soviet Union. So we really feel it's a good opportunity for us to once again set the record straight about just what was the real significance of the October Revolution. And I hope that by the end of today's discussion, you'll appreciate just something of what October meant to the world. Because the reality is, the world has never been the same since the October Revolution. The October Revolution ushered in a new epoch in history, and that epoch is the epoch we are still in and will be in for some time to come, the epoch of socialist revolution. And internationally, not just in the Soviet Union, but internationally, it had a huge effect. So, Harpal, I'd like you to start us off, if you would, talking a little bit about the effect on the imperialist countries of the October Revolution in 1917.
Yes. Hi, both of you. Nice to see you again. Well, its international significance is that before the October Revolution, the imperialist countries were so confident that their system could not be challenged. It was there forever. It was really going to last till eternity. What the October Revolution did was it put an end to that arrogance and that assumption that imperialism and capitalism were here to stay forever. It was the first breach in the imperialist front. And what shook the world was it was unlike any other revolution if you exclude the very brief-lived Paris Commune. It was the first revolution whereby the new ruling class was not going to be an exploiting class which replaced old exploiting classes, but it was going to be the working class which will put an end to all exploitation. And that is really why the October Revolution has throughout aroused so much hostility and so much bile has been poured on the October Revolution by the bourgeoisie, by imperialism and its agents all over the world. It's a revolution which is not a Russian revolution, which is not confined to the national boundaries of old Russian Empire, but it has far greater significance. It goes far beyond the frontiers of the old Russian Empire. It had a worldwide significance. That is why people constantly talk about October Revolution. Even when the Chinese talk of their revolution, they say the salvos of the October Revolution brought socialism to China. Not all countries appreciate that, but that is the truth of the matter, that without the October Revolution, they would have been nowhere. It is something that started a completely new epoch in world history. As you have said rightly, Jyoti, is the epoch of the downfall of imperialism and of proletarian revolution. It may not look like that just as we are talking to each other, but history is like that. Sometimes 30 years pass, as Marx said, nothing happens. And then there come days where in 30 days, those 30 years are compressed and take place very, very quickly and take people by surprise, if you like. And that's what the October Revolution actually did. And it will do so because the world has never been the same. Imperialism has not recovered the stability that it enjoyed before the October Revolution. Everywhere there is struggle, even when it's led by very backward people like the Afghan Taliban. I can really relate it to the after effects of the October Revolution, whereby the oppressed people no longer wish to be dominated by imperialism. They take up cudgels against imperialism, even when at a conscious level, they're anti-communist. They are not openly saying that they are for socialism, but nevertheless, they are striking hammer blows at imperialism. And the defeat of the Americans, for example, in Pakistan, is a perfectly good example in Afghanistan is a perfectly good example, as indeed their defeat in Korea and Vietnam before that. These are events of great significance.
Thanks, Dad. Caleb.
Oh, well, if you want to talk about the immediate after effects of the Russian Revolution in the imperialist countries, it's worth noting that we wouldn't have the FBI if it weren't for the Bolshevik Revolution. Because in 1918 in the United States, we had the first Red Scare, and it was following the Russian Revolution. Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, was thrown in prison for giving an anti-war speech, and it was actually it was a librarian, a congressional librarian, J. Edgar Hoover, who just knew how to scare members of Congress by giving these lectures about communists are coming, the communists, the Reds are coming. And he was good at giving these lectures, and he was then given his own wing of the U.S. Department of Justice, which, was first called the Bureau of Investigation and became the FBI. So, the ruling class was so terrified of the Bolshevik Revolution that they formed the FBI. The FBI itself was formed in response to the Bolshevik Revolution. And we had the Palmer raids in the United States, where thousands of communists and revolutionaries who were not born in the United States were just rounded up in the middle of the night and deported very, very quickly. And there was real terror among the ruling class of the United States about the Bolshevik Revolution and what it meant. The Woodrow Wilson administration, which we're all taught in school in the United States, that he was a progressive, right? He wanted the self-determination of countries. He believed in the League of Nations. He was a progressive. He was quite a reactionary, number one. I mean, he really very much played up, and was an ally of white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan elements. But also, he was very terrified by the Russian Revolution, and he developed a whole apparatus of political repression in response to it. The Communist Party, when it was originally formed, I mean, there were a number of different factions that eventually merged into what became the U.S. Communist Party. They had to hold their unity convention in 1921 in a secret location in the middle of the woods in Michigan. And even that convention was raided by the police, and there was just real terror in the United States on the part of the ruling class, because there was, at the time of the Russian Revolution in the United States, there was massive support for it. There were many, many people, dock workers and labor unionists and steel workers, and among the African American community, there were many people who looked to it with great inspiration. And so the ruling class was terrified. And I think it's, when you look at what happened in the towards the end of World War I, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and in in 1919, 1920, I mean, the heavy-handed political repression we saw was the ruling class responding to this tremendous event, the Bolshevik Revolution, which scared them like nothing else.
Absolutely. I think we had something similar, excuse me for butting in a little bit, but we had something similar here. Some leading communists like John McClane had been imprisoned during World War I. And then during the War of Intervention against the Soviet Union, when I think 14 countries, is that right, Dad? 14 countries involved in invading the new Soviet Russia and trying to overthrow the socialist government there. And the strength of feeling amongst British workers against British involvement in this intervention was so great that dockers refused to load, a very famous incident, they refused to load a ship called the Jolly George, which was supposed to be taking war material, and I think maybe soldiers as well, over to Russia. And there was such a general sense amongst the working class that had been organized by the communists, but this huge swell of sympathy for the new Soviet Republic, for socialism, for workers' government, that the action was backed up by a threat from the Trades Union Congress, which was not a revolutionary organization, but understood the strength of feeling of its members and was forced to put the threat of a general strike to Lloyd George, the Liberal Prime Minister at the time. And the threat was convincing. It was so convincing that Britain pulled out of that war. And Lloyd George, in fact, started granting sort of a few kind of reforms to the working class to try and sort of calm them down. So again, there were big repercussions over here, and our ruling class was very shaken by the support of the workers and by the example that was being given to them. Hopal, would you like to talk to us a bit about the impact in the oppressed countries? Because, gosh, if it reverberated, in the imperialist countries, how much more so did it reverberate October in the oppressed countries?
Well, as both of you know very well, the Tsarist Empire had not only the great Russian nation in it, but a number of other nationalities, and they were oppressed nationalities. And Lenin rightly said Russia was a prison house of nations. And one of the things that Lenin had the foresight to have in his party's program, over which he fought hard, and many people deserted him, including such well-known people as Rosa Luxemburg, who opposed the clause on the right of self-determination. And Rosa Luxemburg even wrote a pamphlet under a pseudonym called Junius. And Lenin didn't know who Junius was, whether it was a man or a woman, but he assumed it was a man. And he wrote a very long article on the Junius pamphlet. So Lenin believed in the right of self-determination of nations, that Russia would, if the Bolsheviks were to come to power, grant the right of self-determination to the oppressed nationalities. Lenin was not in favor of separation, but equally he was not in the business of keeping nations forcibly within the Russian state. He compared it to a divorce. He said, just because you stand for the right of divorce does not mean you are advocating that everybody divorce their spouse. It is just that people should live happily by consent because they're willing and happy to live with each other and not be coerced into living in marriages which are unhappy. And this is something which affected women more than men. Women were forced to cohabit with husbands who just did not meet the civilized standards, if you like. So he said, we are in favor of the right to divorce, but we're not asking everybody to divorce their partners. Likewise, within the state, when there is a multinational state, the nations should be given the right of self-determination. And after the October Revolution, that's precisely what went on. But it's a complicated history, how they rejoined and made their own revolutions and joined the Russian Federation, which became the great and glorious USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And what is important here is, after the October Revolution, by freeing these nations, Russia set a very contagious example. Just as the October Revolution had sent a contagious message to the working class in the imperialist countries, we, by overthrowing the bourgeoisie in one of the largest imperialist countries, have come to power. You can do it too. And you can see why the Bolsheviks were hated by the imperialist bourgeoisie. And by freeing these nations, when most of the world was under colonial domination, under one imperialist power or another, British, French, German, Dutch, Portuguese, whatever you can think of. It sent a contagious example that the people of these colonies can free themselves. And what's more, what it did was, it actually freed these nations that were part of the former Russian Empire, not under the flag of nationalism, not under the flag of enmity, but under the flag of proletarian internationalism. Here is the Russian working class coming to power and saying, comrades, you can live with us. We want you to live with us. We're happy to live with you, but the decision is yours. And so really, it is something unheard of that colonial powers would simply say, okay, you're free. Can you just imagine India being freed by the British, saying, well, no, yes, you have the right to freedom. If the British proletariat had come to power, that's precisely what would have happened. And so it was really a clarion call to the working class of Europe to come to power, free themselves from the clutches of imperialism, and free their colonial slaves from the clutches of their imperialist bourgeoisie. And the flag of proletarian internationalism is so important. so important that workers can actually live together. What divides them is oppression. What divides them is exploitation. Once you take away these factors, people are able happily to live together. 70 years of the existence of the Soviet Union prove that. The moment the Soviet Union collapsed, the old enmities, the old fights came into being, and hundreds of thousands of people being killed, forced to migrate from one territory to another. And so, you see, before the October Revolution, the world was divided into two categories: inferior races and superior races, blacks and whites. Of these, the former were supposed to be the slaves who were destined forever to serve the master races, and the latter were the bearers of civilization. And what the October Revolution proved was that the so-called inferior people, the oppressed nationalities, once they are freed from the clutches of imperialism, are just as much capable of bearing advanced culture, of contributing to the advancement of culture, as are the so-called superior nations. So it shattered forever the myth of superior and inferior races. I know it took several decades before the message sunk, but now even imperialist countries have legislation against racial discrimination. They don't actually implement it properly, but nevertheless, they have to pay lip service to the question of equality of races, equality of nations, and the bourgeoisie as it comes as near its end. There's a total dichotomy between its language and its practice. Language has broken all contact with practice. While they continue to oppress, for example, the Americans continue to oppress Muslim people in the Middle East, they are standing up for the rights of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who allegedly are being oppressed by the Chinese. Now, there is no such oppression, but they carry on this thing as though they are somehow the friends of Muslims. They're not friends of any people, oppressed people, or foreign people, or of their own working class. They're in the business of carrying on with the exploitation, and anything that will serve to divide working people, this, of course, is to their advantage. And by setting this example of freeing the colonized people, the Soviets set a contagious example, and actually was a call to the oppressed people everywhere to revolt against their imperialist masters. So its effect is extremely significant. It's difficult to imagine how there would have been a wave of decolonization had it not been for the October Revolution, particularly after the Second World War, by which the Soviet armies had been victorious in Eastern and Central Europe and had defeated the mightiest military power of that time, namely Nazi Germany.
Caleb.
Oh, wow. Well, it's a really important point that was made just there about how the Bolsheviks saw themselves as allies of all oppressed people against colonialism and against imperialism. I've pointed to how, and it's been worth discussion recently when it comes to Afghanistan, how the Bolsheviks offered military support to the Emir of Afghanistan when he was fighting the British Empire. And of course, the Emir of Afghanistan was not a leftist or a progressive figure by any means, but he was fighting the imperialists. And so they supported him. And I believe the Bolsheviks convened the Conference of the Peoples of the East, a very important gathering in which they met with people from across the Eurasian hemisphere who were opposed to the imperialists and offered their support. And that, the Bolsheviks, they also offered military training and support to the Chinese Revolution before it became a socialist revolution. Now, when it was originally a bourgeois democratic revolution, and Dr. Sun Yat-sen wanted to become a member of the Communist International. Now, Lenin said you're not a Marxist, you're not a communist, so you can't join. But he even granted him observer status. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen the founder of the Chinese modern China, I guess, and China's awakening as a country, was someone who was very close to Lenin and attended the gatherings of the Communist International. And what you said about racism, I mean, it's something that I feel like my generation just doesn't appreciate. Now it's just kind of taken for granted. When we hear these statements about, oh, racism is bad, black and white should be equal. I mean, we almost roll our eyes. It's just so standard. It's just so liberal. But no one talked that way before the Russian Revolution. No one spoke that way. Racism was considered to just be an accepted reality. And the Russian Revolution was a huge event. And black liberation activists in the United States, like W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, read the glowing things that he wrote about the Soviet Union, saying the Soviet Union was the only society he'd ever been to where people of one race were not taught to consider themselves superior to people of another race. There's a very important book called Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood, who was a leader of the U.S. Communist Party. And he describes how he was on the subway in the Soviet Union once during the 1930s, and a drunk person made a racially inappropriate remark, and everyone just, exploded against the person. And the person was actually arrested for making the comment because that was just so contrary to what the Soviet Union was about. And it kind of shows that that the world has really changed, and the lasting impact of the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, nowadays, all across the world, there is this feeling that racism is unacceptable. That wouldn't be the case if it weren't for the Russian Revolution. So people forget that, and we take it for granted now. And now the imperialists act as if they are the purveyors of these socially, conscious, the idea that women should be equal to men. That was also a big part of the Russian Revolution, and a lot of feelings of social justice, breaking down hierarchical forms of oppression and such. That came out of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the imperialists don't remind people of this, and now they actually they try to present themselves as if they are invading countries to liberate the women, or they put sanctions on countries because the country is allegedly is allegedly persecuting some minority or something like that, and they try to take on these values that they wouldn't even have if it weren't for the Bolshevik Revolution in order to sell their empires.
I think that's so important, as you say, Caleb, for people to understand that the imperialists are forced to say these things, which, as Harpal said, are the opposite of how they act, that women are equal, that all men are equal, no matter the color of their skin. They're forced to say it because October proved it, and imperialists lost the moral high ground. The masses came round to the sentiments of the socialists on all these important topics, and it became impossible for the imperialists to talk openly the way they used to. Now they have to hide their real motivations behind these words. But of course, not only does that mean they've had to retreat from what they felt to be their moral high ground, it also means they're constantly caught out in their hypocrisy because their words don't match their deeds. And that's weakened them fatally at the heart. We can see that they don't mean what they say when they talk about anti-racism or anti-sexism. And we can see, how fake it is, this concern for human rights, when you're bombing everybody into smithereens, I wondered, Harpal, if you could talk a little bit about the example of building this completely new society sort of had for the oppressed classes around the world to actually see this new world being built in the Soviet Union.
Well, before the October Revolution, and even after the October Revolution, the refrain of the imperialist bourgeoisie was, yes, the working class may be able to destroy, but it can never build, because construction can only take place under the tutelage of the bourgeoisie. Nobody else can build. Now, one day we will talk extensively about it on another occasion, but the Soviet Union, after the Civil War had and the War of Intervention had ended, went on to build socialism. It was a very complicated affair. The economy was so devastated. The working class almost had ceased to exist. Certain market mechanisms had to be introduced under the new economic policy. But by the end of 27, beginning of 28, the new economic policy was being jettisoned, and full-scale reconstruction was taking place in agriculture as well as in industry. The collectivization plan, the campaign, as well as the first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932. And this 5-year plan, incidentally, was completed in 4 years and three months. Miraculous by any standards. So the working class proved that the Soviet proletariat proved that the working class can not only destroy the old, but build a new socialist society which benefits the vast masses of people, not just the privileged. But to just take one example that you and Caleb were talking about, the position of women. Now, it's the first time that women in class society got an equal status, not in law, which is much easier to do. You pass a law and that's the end of it and you forget about it. The real equality of women, as we have mentioned before, doesn't come about because a few women reach the top position. They become members of the board of directors of large corporations or become chief executives or financial officers of large corporations. Real liberation for masses of women comes when they are introduced into public service and on an equal basis, which can only take place by socializing the services which actually are presently and have been for a long time performed by women, i.e. cooking, laundry, looking after after the children. So it's only when you create kindergartens, creches, cheap dining rooms, and laundry places, it's only then that women can take part on an equal basis. Because what actually enslaves a woman is the fact that she's bound to the four walls of the house doing these jobs. Capitalism, in its own interest, for the sake of profits, is forced to take women into public service. Women have been introduced into public service, into factories, etc. It is definitely a liberating fact as a matter of objective observation. But all the same, when the woman does that, she's torn between looking after her children on the one hand and going to work on the other to earn a living. And what we need to do is that women should be able to work. If she has small babies and she goes to work, there should be a kindergarten there. There should be a creche there. And during the day, she can get time off for mothering her children, looking after her children. That's precisely what happened in the Soviet Union. Nothing flamboyant, nothing showy, but nevertheless, which had an extremely beneficial effect on the life of women. And this is exactly the same in various areas, including, for example, the question of racial discrimination. Nobody discriminates against a Kazakh or a Tajik or a Uzbek or a Georgian. Georgian would be difficult with Stalin being in charge of things, but all the same, people are brought into a position where they enjoyed equal status with the great Russians, where women enjoyed equal status with men. They could no longer be shouted at. They could no longer be told to do this, that, the other. This does not mean that they did not perform motherly duties. They stopped being mothers. They were not like the bourgeois feminists, whose idea of liberation is that you don't become a mother. Humanity needs mothers, as it needs fathers. They have some roles to perform. There will be no humanity without mothers. And so you obviously have a responsibility. And this is one thing that women can do, which men cannot do. And that is, giving birth to children. But at the same time, Soviet society showed women were capable of doing whatever men were capable of. They drove tractors, they flew aeroplanes, they were engineers, they were doctors, they were teachers, and they occupied all sorts of positions. In the end, the bourgeoisie could only say, Soviet women are everywhere, they're a bit butch. Well, as though being an engineer made a woman butch. It doesn't. She's an intellectually gifted person who was in the business of engineering. Driving a tractor is not necessarily a man's job. Anybody can drive a tractor. It's not something that requires extraordinary skills. Anybody can be trained over a period of 2-3 months and become a tractor driver. In my youth, there were hardly any tractors in the villages. Now every village in India, in Punjab anyway, has a huge number of tractors. Every peasant's boy grows up driving a tractor. So it's something which is easily done. And the Soviet Union did those things, which actually improved the position of women.
Caleb.
Wow. Well, when you touched on the industrialization, that is a point that I recall reading the writings of Anna Louise Strong, and just the efforts to industrialize the USSR and really just build up the economy. How the whole world was just in awe of what happened, and that really, I think 1928 was a pivotal year, right after the Trotskyites had been defeated, after the Bukharinite right opposition had been defeated, when Stalin's vision of socialism in one country kind of triumphed, and they launched the 5-year economic plans to industrialize the USSR and sort of rapidly building the country up, the world was really in awe of what happened. And 1929, you had the beginning of the Great Depression in the United States and in the Western world. And so the rest of the world was having a Great Depression, and the Soviet Union was just building and building and building. And it was really an inspiration to the world. And people forget this. We're all constantly told, well, communism doesn't work, or it never achieved anything. Oh, countries have always just been in poverty because of communism. And it's the contrary. If you look at what happened, I mean, how they turned the USSR very quickly into the world's top steel producing country. They built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine. They built this country up from nothing. I mean, and the details that you read about it, even in bourgeois mainstream publications like the New York Times, and the whole world was looking at the Soviet Union and saying, how is this possible? How can they rapidly build themselves up so quickly? And how can they have so much economic growth? I mean, it was real economic miracles that were happening. And there's been such an effort to obscure this, but it is true. I mean, when you look at the details, I mean, the USSR, before the communists came to power, it was an agrarian country, large illiteracy, very little electrification. You look at what started in 1928. By 1936, they were a superpower. They were a fully industrialized economic powerhouse, and that was because of socialism, and that was because of central planning. And what you said about women and the empowerment of women, that is also very true, right? And you talk about, they had women that were high leaders of the military, and women high up in the government, and women electrical engineers, and women doctors, and that was the result of the Bolshevik Revolution. And the achievements were astounding, and the whole world was kind of shaken by what they saw. And efforts to cover this up and obscure this don't change the reality. I mean, you just pull up the numbers. When people say socialism and communism doesn't work, it doesn't lead to countries growing, they're talking about something that couldn't be further from the truth. And we just need to remind people of this as much as possible, because this is the justification. When Bernie Sanders was running, as a kind of just a social democratic candidate, in every debate and every conversation where he's advocating that we have a national healthcare system in the United States, oh, you can't do that. The Soviet Union tried that and it didn't work. Well, it actually did work quite well in the Soviet Union. Oh, he wanted to give everyone, college. Oh, you can't do that. If you do that, that's you look, the Soviet Union fell. And no, the Soviet Union had a huge amount of economic success. Here in New York City, there was a law that was going to be passed and Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor Bloomberg was arguing against that the city would have to pay every firm that the city contracted would have to pay a certain minimum wage that was higher than the regular minimum wage. And New York City's Mayor Bloomberg said he was opposed to it. We can't, pay a minimum wage to employees at the firms contracted by the city, because he said, because the Soviet Union, they tried to do things like that and they collapsed. So we can't do it. And it's like this mythology, I call it the myth of the 20th century. This idea that socialism hasn't worked or has failed, this myth is underlying almost everything in U.S. society, and we have to face it head on. And people, the problem, I think, one of the biggest problems in the socialist movement is a failure to take this myth on straight up. You just have to say, people, that's not true. You can't say, well, no. You have to just right in the face say, no, that's false. The Soviet Union became a superpower with socialism. China became a superpower with socialism. Cubans live far better than Haitians do, than people all throughout the Caribbean do because of socialism. I mean, socialism has had tremendous successes. It has proved a successful alternative to capitalism. And that is an established fact. And the Russian Revolution was the first example of it. But there have been many countries that, with socialism, with 5-year economic planning, with the leadership of a Marxist-Leninist party, have lifted people out of poverty, have eradicated illiteracy, have industrialized their countries, electrified their countries. Socialism clearly works, and we need to fight this mythology head on.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Caleb. And all of those advances you're talking about, sorry, that Harpala's been talking about, we also mustn't forget that everywhere else in the world at the same time was suffering under the Great Depression. The numbers of starving and out of work people who were traipsing homeless across the United States while such things were being totally eradicated in the Soviet Union. In Britain, we had hunger marches of unemployed men coming down from the north to London saying, give us food. We had a huge unemployed movement being organized of great militancy by the communists because, the world capitalist crisis was so deep and so grave. And the imperialists had no way out of that except for fascism and World War II. The Soviets were totally untouched. Their growth charts go like this during the period that everybody else's economy was going like that. And that in itself was such a kind of wake-up call to the workers all over the world. And no wonder that our ruling classes were terrified about it. And I really would recommend to people to read some of the eyewitness accounts to what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time. There's some really beautiful ones written, and they bring this new society to life like nothing else can. Really, really doesn't, because our heads are so filled with lies that we don't realize, even those of us who are socialists or communists or Marxists, we don't realize how we're affected by the blanket of lies and the constant repetition of lies about life in the Soviet Union. So I would recommend a couple, definitely the books by Anna Louise Strong, in particular one called The Stalin Era. It's quite a short little book, but very inspiring. There's a book by a guy called Hewlett Johnson called The Socialist Sixth of the World. Really, really fantastic, figures and eyewitness accounts of different aspects of life in that book. And Soviet Democracy by Pat Sloan. Again, these really bring to life the new society that was being built and the really human conditions that were allowing people to unleash their potential in a way that's just like a dream for workers right now in the imperialist countries, never mind the oppressed countries. I wanted to come on to the question of how the Soviet Union, Harpal, really created a base for the world revolution. We're often taught, well, the Trotskyists tell us, and our historians and bourgeois kind of politicians repeat Trotsky's lies, that Trotsky was in favor of world revolution and Stalin was in favor of just keeping the revolution in one country. Some kind of selfishly wanted to hoard socialism. And this was the big difference between them, and wasn't Stalin mean. But of course, Stalin, as Lenin before him, talked constantly about the Soviet Union being the motherland for all workers and creating a base for the world revolution. And they didn't just say that as words and resolutions, they acted on it, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Soviet Union did become a base for the proletariat of all countries. It was quite rightly regarded as the motherland of the proletariat of the entire world, and even the motherland of the oppressed peoples of the entire world. Revolutionaries who were persecuted converged in on Moscow, and Moscow assumed the position of the revolutionary center of the world in exactly the same way as Paris had become after the great French bourgeois revolution, where every anti-monarchist, every persecuted Democrat came to Paris. And Paris was hated. And the Jacobins were hated because they were the most radical wing of the bourgeoisie. They didn't stand by ceremony, and they invented wonderful things like tumbrils and guillotines, and very quickly disposed of their enemies, didn't really stand for what you call the rule of law and all the rest of it, because the revolution has got its own laws. It is not actually abiding by ordinary laws. It is unhindered by these laws. It carries on its remorseless work. And they disposed of the French monarchy, they disposed of the feudal classes in a way that no other bourgeois revolution in Europe did. It didn't happen in England, it didn't happen in many other countries, but the French did in a very thoroughgoing manner. Likewise, the Bolsheviks actually created a base where revolutionaries from all over the world came. And precisely for that reason, the name Bolshevik was hated by the bourgeoisie all over the place. There was no sin, there was no crime that they would not pin on the Bolsheviks, from eating babies for breakfast to communalizing women, where you're not allowed to marry a woman. Women were just common stock, and you came in the morning and you queue and you took the woman that was available when your turn came. Very, very crude propaganda, but obviously you spread it day after day, produce fake pictures, and the average idiot begins to believe that. But the Soviet Union actually did become, and Soviet Union didn't wish the Russian Revolution to be an isolated affair. It became a center for, as Jyoti has said, for world revolutionary movement, precisely because the perspective of the Bolsheviks, of Lenin, of Stalin, etc., was a world revolutionary perspective. And they were not adventurous. They were not trying to export revolution. But when the chances came for extending the area of socialism, they did that, as for example, in the aftermath of the Second World War. Deutscher makes a completely stupid point that after the Second World War, Stalin put into effect Trotsky's theory of socialism in several countries. Socialism in several countries. The whole point of Trotsky's theory, which perhaps one day we need to discuss separately from this one because it's a topic by itself. The whole point of Trotsky's is socialism could not be built. It could not be built in a single country. So when Trotsky was subsequently to talk about Russian Revolution being betrayed by Stalin, well, it's a bit rich coming from a person who thought socialism could not be built. If it couldn't be built, there's nothing to betray. The fact is that it could be built, and it was built. What's more, it was built in the most difficult of circumstances. Most bourgeois countries became strong through a number of methods: taking foreign loans, exploiting other countries, colonies, etc., or winning in war and getting reparations. The Russian Revolution did not benefit from these. For the obvious reason, they were not exploiting the colonies. For the obvious reason, they did not want to contract usurious loans. They wanted to borrow money, but even on ordinary trade terms, nobody would loan money to them in case it helped them build up. And when the first 5-year plan was published, every bourgeois, in a very serious man declared, it's pie in the sky, it can never be fulfilled. It'll end up in smoke. And yet, each quarter as the Soviet Union made progress, and by the end of the 5-year plan, when Soviet Union had built huge new enterprises, had renovated the old industry, had collectivized agriculture, and organized agriculture on a cooperative basis, and the largest agricultural farms, 100,000 hectares, grain factories, which no capitalist country, even the United States, could not do because other private owners of land come in between, and they can't really manage to create such large farms. The Soviet Union did do all that. And by doing so, it showed to the working class that if you come to the power in your countries, you can do even better than us, because we were backward when we started. You are in advanced countries. You can do the same much more quickly and perhaps better than us. And that's precisely why the Soviet Union welcomed foreign workers' delegations to come to Russia. As Stalin said, we are exercising our influence on the world revolutionary movement in these few years of peaceful coexistence through our economic work. It gives tremendous amount of confidence to the working class that the working people are capable of building a new society. One of the endeavors of the bourgeoisie has always been to undermine the confidence of the working class in the possibility and the inevitability of its own victory. And what the Soviet Union did by building socialism was to instill that confidence in the working people. And they wanted to give account of their work, not only to the working class at home, but to the working class from other countries. I mean, they had an extremely humble attitude in this respect. We've got to give account to the British, to the American, to the French, to the German workers. As Stalin said, we are called the shock brigade of the international proletariat. In order to justify that title, we have to prove that we actually are the shock brigade. I built socialism, built industry to prove that we are actually capable of building a new society which will change the face of the earth, when exploitation would be a distant past memory, when people would not understand how did we live under exploitation. It's a peculiar system. It's not something very natural. The average bourgeois thinks that a person is born with nose, ears, etc., and a shop or a business. That is not the case. Most of the time in its existence, humanity did not have exploitation. It's only for brief 10,000 years that it has faced exploitation. And the future is not in exploitation, but getting rid of that exploitation. And the Soviet Union actually provided that basis. Even if the Soviet Union has collapsed, for the collapse of which we will have to discuss some other time, the reasons for it. But the fact is, the Soviet Union shall forever continue to be the eloquent testimony of the strength of socialism, of the strength of centrally planned economies as opposed to bourgeois economies. People will tell you central planning doesn't work. It's inefficient. Well, what could be more inefficient that regularly you have recurrent crises of overproduction? When millions of workers are thrown out of their jobs, when products are destroyed, when industry actually is shut and nothing takes place because we have produced so much that people are not there to buy it. We go without food because there's too much food. We go without housing because there's too much housing. We go without clothing because there's too much clothing. And that is what is terrible about capitalism. And the Soviet Union by 1931 had eliminated unemployment. The first country in the world to actually end unemployment. Unemployment is a scourge around the neck of the working class, it's a millstone around the neck of the working class. You have no work, you have no money to live on, you don't know what the morrow will bring. I mean, Caleb would know, he comes from the United States of America during the Depression. There were 40 million unemployed in the Western world, of which 10 million were in the United States. There were people living in card boxes around railway lines. They came to be called Hoovervilles, after President Hoover. That's how they were living. And this is at a time when Soviet Union was building houses for workers, which were airy, which had light, and which had modern facilities. I'm not saying they lived in palaces, no. But compared with what had been there before, they provided decent accommodation fit for human beings. These were the achievements of the Soviet Union.
Caleb.
Sure. Well, I think it's really important to talk about how, the orientation of the Bolsheviks changed Marxism, because Marx thought that the first workers' revolutions would be in the West. He thought they would be in the Western capitalist countries. The idea was that they were the most advanced along the road, right? That, out of feudalism comes capitalism, then out of capitalism comes socialism. And since capitalism was the most developed in the United States and Britain and France and Germany, that this is where the revolutions would happen. But it was Lenin who had the understanding that no, because of imperialism and the emergence of these international monopolies and big corporations based in the Western countries that are dominating the world and holding back development, that the revolutionary energy would be in the East, and it would be from people in the colonized world fighting for their national liberation. That would be the way that socialism came into the world, and that understanding, that break with Karl Marx's kind of view that that the West was the most important, that break was very, very important. And Trotskyism and was really a refusal to recognize what Lenin had understood. It was this belief that, well, the theory of permanent revolution, that, well, unless the revolution spreads into the West, it doesn't count. Unless it spreads into the Western capitalist countries, it really has no value. It's doomed. It's going to become bureaucratized and reactionary. And there's no hope unless communism spreads to the West. And the crazy thing is, we're living now. I mean, it's well over 100 years since the Russian Revolution. We are living now in full validation of why Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution was wrong. As we see Russia and China, both of which lifted off with a socialist revolution, emerging to become strong, powerful countries as the West deteriorates into more chaos, dropping living standards and instability. And this belief that the world is just always going to be centered around the West, and unless Britain and France and Germany and the United States have a socialist revolution, there's no hope. That's an illusion. Russia and China are rising. Countries throughout the developing world that have aligned with Russia and China are getting stronger. And this belief that the world is always just going to be centered around the United States and the Western capitalist countries, it's just being debunked. China is rising. Russia is rising. And there are many countries, that the Bolivarian countries of Latin America are getting stronger in alliance with Russia and China. Iran has gotten much stronger. I mean, the level of development there is massive as they align with Russia and China, and that this illusion that a lot of Trotskyists and even those who want to cling to what was correct in Marx's time, because that was true in the time that Marx was alive. The working class movement was the most advanced in Germany and in France and in Britain and elsewhere. But the world changed, and because of imperialism and because of the development and the stratification of the working class in the imperialist homelands during the 20th century, the development of the aristocracy of labor, the revolutionary energy in the world shifted. However, I would argue that now, as Western capitalism is in a crisis spawned by the computer revolution and a new crisis of overproduction, and we're seeing dropping living standards, now I would argue that the revolutionary energy is once again shifting, and that there is once again now hope for revolutionary resistance within the West, and that as living standards are dropping in the imperialist homelands, once again, things are shifting to where there is hope for socialist and revolutionary movements in Western capitalist countries. But the only hope for them to have any effect is the orientation of the left needs to change, because the organized political left over the course of the 20th century, and especially after the Second World War, has developed this orientation of kind of operating as the kind of moralistic critics of imperialism, and not as the organizers of the broad masses of people. But now, as we're starting to see living standards drop and increasing unemployment and such among the working people in the Western capitalist countries, it's once again time for the Marxists and the socialists to step up and become the leaders of the broad masses of working people in the Western countries. So the understanding what Lenin put forward and how the Bolshevik Revolution was based on this new orientation of understanding what imperialism is vital to really understand it. That Leninism and Bolshevism broke with the standard Marxist understanding, this theory of imperialism, and this understanding of the importance of national liberation for oppressed nations. This understanding that the Bolsheviks had enabled them to make the revolution, and it changed Marxism very significantly. There's a reason that the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and it's because the Bolsheviks had kind of pioneered and made new developments in Marxist theory. And we're not clinging to the old ways. Lenin wrote about the Second International as a stinking corpse. And at the time that the Russian Revolution happened, all of the major socialist and Marxist parties of Europe had sold out the workers and supported World War I, and sent their own workers out to die. And Rosa Luxemburg took a stand in Germany, and Eugene Debs in the United States. But overall, social democracy was becoming a bankrupt movement of reformism that was supporting imperialism. But the Bolsheviks had the understanding to break with that and develop a whole new understanding of imperialism.
Thanks, Caleb. You've brought us really nicely there to the next question I was going to ask about, which is the way that, Lenin, before World War I, was seen by a lot of the established socialist parties in Western Europe as a kind of very confrontational character, and quite sort of extreme left, and really somebody that they found sort of uncomfortable to be around, and sort of unnecessarily what we would now call bullshit, aggravational, and always picking fights. He needs to be more friendly and more conciliatory and stop picking fights with everybody. But of course, practice proved him right on every single one of the points, and he was right to pick the fights he picked. And now we study the fights he picked to understand the importance of those ideological disputes that he was having, because they cleared the path for the success of the October Revolution. And having made that revolution, the success of Leninism really inspired a kind of ideological revolution across the world and throughout the world socialist movement. And Harpal, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it takes me to that point. One of the great contribution of Lenin was, and really its germ is in Marx and Engels as well, and that is that the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat for its own emancipation in the centers of imperialism would be a sham and a humbug unless they were united with the oppressed peoples of the world. There's a world front against imperialism, the proletariat in the imperialist countries and the oppressed peoples in the so-called third world countries, if you like. Instead of treating them with contempt, as was hitherto the practice, even among the labor movement in European countries, you have to treat them as comrades and friends who are on the same front line in the struggle against imperialism, to bring the unity of the proletarian revolutionary movement with the national liberation movement is one of the great contributions of Leninism. And that's precisely why the October Revolution resonated with the oppressed peoples, not because they were necessarily socialist, but because they spoke to their needs and to their desires. If you were even a bourgeois fighting for the independence of India, you had a certain warmth towards the Soviet Union because it was the only country that defended your right to be independent. And the Soviet Union had to make its progress under not only the barrage of bourgeois propaganda coming from the imperialist countries, but also against the internal enemies, the Trotskyites and Bukharinites. In their different ways, they did not believe socialism could be built. They did not have any confidence and faith in the internal forces in the Soviet Union, in the strength of the working class to build a new society. And so what the building of socialism in the Soviet Union did, as indeed the October Revolution started the process, is that it gave a mortal blow to social democracy. Before the First World War and the October Revolution, the Social Democrats saw that they did very little to promote the cause of the proletarian dictatorship, nevertheless could flaunt the banner of Marxism. But after they came out against the October Revolution, it was impossible for them to pretend that they were on the same side as the revolutionary proletariat. So it actually delivered a mortal blow to social democratism. It pushed social democracy into the camp of the servitors of imperialism, which they were. And the lesson continues to be very important for us. The working class in European countries will not be even within a striking distance of its enemies unless it destroys social democracy. When we say that, people say, so you're in favor of the Tories. No, we're not in favor of the Tories. We're just against two Tory parties. Just because one calls itself Labour, and in Caleb's country as the Democratic Party, it doesn't make them socialist. They're as much of imperialists. You only have to see the conduct of American democratic administrations from Harry to Truman onwards to the present day. They're reactionary as the other party. Sometimes I feel they're more reactionary than the other party. They try to hide their reactionary politics under the slogans of rule of law, democracy, human rights, but they're putting the boot into the working class and the oppressed peoples under these highfalutin slogans. And so it's extremely important to understand, and it's difficult to underestimate the importance, the important role played by the Bolshevik Revolution and by the Bolshevik leadership in giving a blow to social democracy. Because Lenin quite rightly said in his preface to Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, these people are the purveyors of bourgeois ideology among the working class. Privileged section of the working class. Lenin borrowed this term from the American De Leon, and so labor aristocracy. Their style of life, their attitude toward life, their standard of living actually separates them from ordinary workers. And as Lenin says, in the battle between, he was very fond of using symbolisms from the French Revolution, between the Jacobins and the Versailles, they would always be on the side of Versailles, i.e. the reactionaries. Now you literally have to just look around what they're trying to do. The English Tories, the British Labour Party, the Republican Party in America, the Democratic Party in America, they are united as one in wanting to oppress their own people at home and wage war against people abroad. Hardly a minute passes without new news which is meant to provoke a war. They find it very difficult to wage this war. They find it very difficult to convince their people it'd be a good idea to have a war. So they're trying to create public opinion. In my view, they will not succeed. And as regards the point of center of revolution does not rest in one place all the time. Like in bourgeois revolutions, at one time it was England and Holland. Then France became the center of that. And in terms of socialist revolutions, Russia was the center, Europe was the center. Lately it has shifted to other places, but it's not forever. We're not giving up our hope in the European proletariat rising. It will rise. In the end, slogans do not feed anybody. They do not bring any joy to people. People want to find out, why is their national health service, for example, in Britain, being undermined? Why is it being sold to private interests? Why are there no houses? Is there no shortage of buildings in Britain? No. You could solve the housing problem overnight by billeting working class families in the empty buildings that are lying around. After the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe, I happened to be in Germany. I was giving lectures, making a presentation of one or two of my books which had been translated into German. And I went to the eastern part of the country, to places like Dresden. And what do you find? There were houses boarded up because they were empty. They couldn't be made use of. And just outside those houses, people sleeping in sleeping bags on the pavements because they were homeless. Can you see the lunacy of the whole thing? That you have homes which are lying empty and you have homeless workers lying on the pavement. And European weather is not very kind to people who sleep outside. It's very cold and it brings death and disease with it. And that's what capitalism does. So the European working class, sooner or later, I hope sooner, is going to understand that. And when that happens, it will actually assume its honorable place in the League of World Revolutionary Countries. And when it does, it will probably be able to become the center of world revolution. I've got nothing against Europe being the center of revolution, center of the world. The question is, what kind of world is it? If it's a proletarian world, if the proletariat of Europe coming to power actually is helping the peoples in the oppressed countries to liberate themselves and to build their economies, I'm all in favor of the center being in Europe. And it's only in this way that the center in one place will cease to be the center in one place. There will be revolutionary centers all over the world.
Beautiful. Thanks, Rapal. Caleb.
Sure. Well, when Lenin was forming the party of new type. And if you read What Is to Be Done, he was building a different kind of organization than the Social Democrats of Europe and the Marxist movement of Europe. I mean, he broke with he talked about how the Bolsheviks were not a debating society. And if you read What Is to Be Done, he's complaining about this quote unquote freedom of criticism, and how the model that these European social democratic parties had was one that allowed them to become controlled by the bourgeoisie. Often their press was not controlled by the party. It was controlled by private individuals who happened to be in the party, who had enough money to have a press, for example. And in a lot of ways, like the labor movement, the labor bureaucrats were able to dominate these parties because they were the leaders of labor unions, and so they gained influence. And that by having this kind of loose structure, these parties were able to kind of lose their revolutionary energy. But the idea was the Bolshevik Party was for those who gave the whole of their lives to the revolutionary movement. And you read some of the attacks on Lenin. They attacked the Bolsheviks, and they said, well, he's not forming a party; he's forming a monastic order. They compared it to like the Jesuits or the Franciscans or something like that. And nowadays, the language that's commonly used to attack organizations that function this way with democratic centralism, they use words like cult. That's generally the slur that's used, and that's the idea is that these are not liberal open organizations where everything is just kind of up for debate and everyone just kind of does what they feel like. No, they're asking people to give the whole of their lives, to live a disciplined life, to make sacrifices, to go along with decisions that they may themselves not agree with. The understanding of a democratic centralist organization is that once a decision is made, everyone is obligated to carry it out, whether they agree or not. Unity in action, and that the Bolshevik form of organization was a break with the liberal way of organizing, and I think that people kind of forget that, and that it developed into the Bolshevik Revolution. And if you want to see the failure of social democracy in the United States, you in Britain, you've had phonies and imperialists speaking in the name of socialism all the time. I think Tony Blair at one point was quoting Marx or something like that. Here in the United States, especially since the end of the Second World War, we haven't had that so much. So when we call them the squad, right? These AOC and Ilhan Omar and a couple other these four socialist figures in the Democratic Party were elected. There was so much rejoicing. Oh, we've got socialists in Congress. It's amazing. It's just so amazing. And now, I mean, they've been in for a good 4 years now. And they have proved to be just as bad, if not in some cases worse, than the rest of the Democratic Party. They are more pro-imperialist. They are in favor of tearing down and attacking countries. They want the mainstream media to be censored and to silence what they call conspiracy theories, which is questioning anything that's said by the mainstream media. They are vicious imperialists. They are not on our side. But yet they speak in the name of socialism. And that was a huge wake-up call for a lot of people, about that just because someone calls themselves a socialist, just because someone's critical of capitalism and wants people to have jobs and healthcare, doesn't make them your friend. And that in many ways, they've proven that they don't even believe in the socialist platitudes they claim to believe in. The reformist petty socialism they claim to believe in, they don't even believe it. When we're having a pandemic, can you think of a better time to demand healthcare for the working class? But yet they refuse to put up a fight in Congress for healthcare, to put it up to a vote. And then when serious people who were social democrats but just believed in it, put up with this idea, they call force the vote, to demand a vote on national health care, their response was to accuse them of being fascists and accuse them of being Trump supporters and say, oh, if you're making demands on the squad, you're right wing, you're racist, you're a fascist. And so we're seeing that social democracy is clearly bankrupt. I mean, we're seeing that very, very clearly in the United States. You guys have known that for decades. You've known that. You've known about the Labor Party and its treachery. But now we're having to learn this all over again. But it's an important moment of awakening where we're seeing that social democracy is not our friend. And we're also learning that you do need to build a party of new type, and that you do need to eventually establish an organization where people give the whole of their lives, or the party press is not, whichever member has the most money and wants to start their own press and therefore has the influence, but rather building a disciplined working class democratic centralist combat organization is what is ultimately necessary if you're going to defeat the imperialists. We're learning that again here in the United States. And as we see this kind of blossom of suddenly now socialism is up for discussion, we're learning these old lessons once again, I would say.
Thanks, Caleb. Sorry, Harpal, I was going to say we've been talking for quite a while, and I think we're going to come back to the general topic of October with a slightly different focus on another day. Is there something that you would like to say before we kind of wrap up?
Just very quickly, Caleb mentioned in his last contribution, Lenin's What is to be done. If one wanted to sum up Lenin's What is to be done, it simply can be summed up in one single short sentence: without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And what the Western proletariat has done, and since the ravages of Khrushchevite revisionism, is given up on theory. Everything else is fine. That's practical. What you're doing is just theory. Pure theory is just airy-fairy nonsense, and you want to give it up. The old communists read Capital, 3 volumes. They read serious books. They read Engels' Anti-Düring. They read all sorts of material. These days, youngsters do not do that. If we want to build a movement, I'm afraid we're 100 years behind Bolsheviks. We've got to start anew. It's better to start anew now than wait for another 50 years and learn the same lesson. And perhaps one day, if you two are inclined to do it, we can just devote the whole session to discussing Lenin's What is to be done, or what is to be done and 1 step forward, 2 steps back. These are the building blocks of revolutionary movement. The importance of revolutionary theory and the importance of a working class organization, without which the working class has nothing. So I've taken too much of your time. I better be quiet.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sure we are going to come back to all of these really important points again. I think it's a really good note to end on, to remind people what it is we're doing here. We're not here to provide content for people's amusement who are sitting on YouTube. We are putting these talks up to try to do our part in educating the movement, in helping our fellow workers to understand the significance of scientific socialism, which is as a weapon, as a guide to action, as our enlightenment, as our strength in being able to organize ourselves and orient our organization, orient our practical activity so that we too can be successful, so that socialism is not nice stories of the past. And I could listen to those stories forever, but the reason I can listen to them and feel so inspired by them is because I don't just hear nice stories of what people once did. I see visions of our future. I understand that October didn't die with the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. October lives. It lives in the future. It lives with all of us. It lives with humanity. October began the next phase of history, and it's our job to make sure that phase is carried to completion and socialism frees all of humanity from its present troubles. So thank you once again to both of you for today's really lovely discussion. I look forward to the next one. Thank you to everyone who's watching or listening. Alal salam to all of you. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.